Then, as now, Londoners seem to enjoy feeding pigeons. This early 1900s view of the Strand includes the frontage of Charing Cross Station, just visible behind the traffic. Railways first reached the capital in the 1830s, and by 1900 had become its major form of transportation, both for passenger and goods traffic, such as the milk churns being manoeuvred here. The existence of railways meant that people could live in one of the fast-growing suburbs but travel to and from the city to work. For shorter distances, however, there were the horse buses, although travel on these could be incredibly slow, particularly when hampered by roadworks. In the early years of the century, the horse still reigned supreme on London's roads. The pollution of modern traffic jams was still a long way in the future, even though overcrowding was not. In addition to hauling buses, trams and hansom cabs, horses were also used to pull carts of produce to and from the big London markets. This short glimpse of traffic near Westminster Abbey is thought to date from the time when streets were decorated for the coronation of King Edward VII. Boater hats and sun parasols abound in a London which now only exists on old film. More contemporary fashions are paraded for us at the White City exhibition of 1908. It seems that the newfangled motor car was such a novelty that it was featured as one of the rides. There was also a spectacular mountain scenic railway which cost over £20,000 to construct. Photographers have always had an eye for attractive ladies, and this fashionable trio are obviously no exception. The hobble skirt may have been the height of fashion, but must have made stepping on and off buses rather difficult. Following the development of the internal combustion engine, London's traffic was drastically transformed. Buses were now motorised, but their top decks were still open to the elements. There were various operators in the capital at this time, although by far the largest was the London General Omnibus Company. Their famous B-type open topper, first introduced in 1910, was later to see service overseas, when over 1,000 of them were commandeered for service during the First World War. Within a decade or so, horse-drawn vehicles on the streets of London were becoming less and less, although for some they remained the only way to travel. The girls' hemlines and cloche hats clearly date this sequence to the 1920s. The build-up of traffic around the Bank is obviously not a new thing, as these views with open-top buses very much in evidence clearly illustrate. Some people preferred the underground system to the buses, whilst the better off travelled by taxi. The River Thames has long served London as a means of transporting merchandise, and we will take a closer look at the docks later in this programme. Tower Bridge was opened on the 30th of June 1894, having been built to the design of Sir Horace Jones and Sir J. Wolfe Barry. Traffic was controlled by means of semaphore signals, and a bell would ring when the bridge was about to open for a ship to pass underneath. Once the final vehicle had cleared, the twin bascules with their span of 200 feet would be raised and the vessel could safely pass through. Semaphores were also used to control traffic on the river. After the ship had passed, the bridge was lowered and road traffic could recommence. Those wishing to cross the bridge on foot were provided with a pair of walkways 142 feet above the high water mark. These allowed a fine view of the bridge and the surrounding area. Here a paddle steamer passes under London Bridge. These were once a familiar sight on the Thames, providing Londoners with a pleasurable means of reaching resorts such as Southend or Margate. Once at their destination, passengers would disembark and enjoy a few hours on the beach. These views, taken around Manor Park and East Ham in King George V's coronation year of 1910, show some of the buses and trams which then served the area. To the left can be seen the frontage of East Ham Station on the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway. After a glimpse of traffic near East Ham Town Hall, we moved to the inner East End, which had a large Jewish community. This is Whitechapel Road, with a tram emerging from Cambridge Heath Road. This fine view of LCC trams at Gardiner's Corner, Aldgate, also provides us with a rare glimpse of St Mary's Church, which was destroyed in the Second World War. Still in the East End, a Great Eastern train passes over the Regent's Canal at Stepney, while a barge passes underneath. This is Mile End Road, showing Stepney Green Station, which opened with the cut and cover Whitechapel and Bow Railway in 1902. The pioneer Underground Railway in London was the Metropolitan, opened between Farringdon Street and Bishop's Road, Paddington in 1863. The system quickly grew and was soon expanding through suburban stations such as this at Marlborough Road into the home counties, where it shared metals with the Great Central Main Line. We are now approaching Harrow-on-the-Hill station and can see the conductor rails laid for the electrification to Uxbridge in 1904. Electric traction heralded a completely new era, both for the cut-and-cover underground lines such as the Metropolitan and for the tramways. In some cases, the inauguration of an electric tram route was deemed important enough to merit a royal attendance. This is a scene on the 15th of March 1903 with the Prince and Princess of Wales travelling in a specially decorated car belonging to the London County Council. Tramway electrification was first introduced to the capital by the London United Company in 1901 and evidently attracted a crowd. Electric trams eventually extended deep into suburbia, serving towns and villages outside the metropolitan area such as Barnet and Waltham Cross. They offered both convenience and cheap fares and soon became popular with the travelling public. Such was the public delight in tram travel that a song was written about it called Riding on Top of the Car. This was sung by George Lashwood and featured in the music halls around 1905. As time progressed, bigger and better trams were required. Among these were some attractive vehicles built by the Union Construction and Finance Company of Feltham in the early 1930s. These were used by both the London United Tramways and Metropolitan Electric Tramways, and in recognition of their place of origin became known as Felthams. The new vehicles were very advanced for their time and represented a vast technical improvement on the cars which they replaced. With the Feltons working many of the routes, it became possible to withdraw older, time-expired vehicles and consign them to the scrapyard where they were broken up. This is one of the new Feltham cars working to Acton on route number 7. The fashions of the time clearly dictated that everyone on board should wear a hat. Improvements also came on the underground system. Between 1922 and 1934, over 1,400 new cars were built to a basic design later known as standard stock. They were constructed by various builders, including the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, Camel Laird of Nottingham, Metro Camel, and the UCF at Feltham, who produced the trams seen earlier. They saw service throughout the tube system and looked particularly attractive in their livery of red and cream. This view shows a Piccadilly line train near Barons Court. Although referred to as standard stock, the vehicles embodied various detail changes which made some cars subtly different from each other. They were very successful, and after withdrawal from London Transport in the 1960s, a number of them were transferred to British Rail service on the Isle of Wight. We are now on the Metropolitan line at Wembley Park and see a T-stock unit for Watford waiting at the platform as grey liveried electric loco number 12, Sarah Siddons, passes by with a fast train. Although the majority of the Metropolitan line had been electrified, steam still made an appearance, particularly on non-passenger turns, such as seen here at Harrow on the Hill. Still at Harrow, we witness the arrival and departure of a T-stock train bound for Baker Street. Although these scenes date from the post-war era, the T-stock, or MW stock as it was originally known, was first introduced in the mid-1920s. Relic which survived into the second half of the 20th century was the steamwork Chalfont to Chesham shuttle, seen here powered by a former Great Central Railway 442 tank. In May 1931, London United introduced the first successful trolleybuses to the capital and put them into service between Twickenham and Teddington. These early vehicles had a very distinctive front end with a centrally positioned single headlights similar to that employed on the trams. They were soon nicknamed diddlers, and although there have been various explanations as to why this should be, the origins remain obscure. Here we see a diddler working alongside the trams, which one day trolleybuses and motorbuses would eventually replace. years that followed, the diddler design evolved into handsome vehicles such as these. The majority of London's trolleybuses ran on 6 wheels as seen here, although a solitary 4-wheeler was placed in service during 1934 and allocated to Fulwell Depot. Prior to the formation of the London Passenger Transport Board in 1933, bus services around the capital remained in the hands of various operators, including the London General Omnibus Company, whose red and white vehicles, with their fleet name General, could be seen alongside less remembered types. These scenes around Piccadilly Circus show typical road vehicles of the time, including a number of General buses. Here we are at Hyde Park around the same period, with people going about their daily business and a policeman on point duty controlling the traffic. Various private cars can be seen, and although these vary in size from the humble sit-up and beg types to commodious limousines, cars in the 1930s were generally only available for the better off. The same can be said of horse riding in Hyde Park, which was regarded amongst the gentry as being very fashionable. However, for the majority of ordinary Londoners, the only means of travel was by foot or public transport. Here are some typical buses of the period, including a 6-wheeled LT type introduced by the LGOC in 1929. London's familiar red buses have become as much a part of the capital as the pomp and ceremony of changing of the guard. This is Whitehall with the famous cenotaph, erected in 1920 to the design of Sir Edwin Lutyens in commemoration of those who died in the Great War. As can be seen, the 6-wheeled LT class buses are very much in evidence. We now return to Trafalgar Square, a spot featured earlier in our programme, but this time we see it in the early 1930s. The passing vehicles may have changed, but the endless fascination of pigeon feeding continues as before. Since the early days of mechanised transport, London's buses had grown into a vast fleet comprising many distinct and varied classes. Amongst others, we see LT, NS and ST types going about their daily business. Beneath the decorations for the 1937 coronation of King George VI comes one of the distinctive STL class buses working on route number 6. The STLs owed their origin to an LGOC design of 1932 and were later built in large numbers. They soon became a standard type and were a familiar sight throughout London. When London Transport was formed in 1933, it inherited numerous vehicles and a fine system of underground railways. They all had their distinctive styles of architecture. The tube lines, built by the American financier Charles Tyson Yerkes, employed the services of the architect Leslie Green. Many of his fine buildings still survive. The Central London Railway were less ambitious. The City and South London occasionally added the odd embellishment. Surface lines like the Metropolitan and District also produced some attractive buildings. In some cases, these featured impressive iron and glass overall roofs. The modern style favoured by the LPTB is epitomised by the work of Charles Holden, whose fine, clean designs were a milepost in station architecture. The familiar trams inherited by the LPTB were much loved by Londoners and used for all sorts of journeys. In central areas, the electric current was drawn from a central conduit by means of a pickup known as a plough, whilst further out it was from overhead wiring. An unusual part of the system was the Kingsway subway. It linked Southampton Road with the Victoria Embankment and featured the spectacular 1 in 10 gradient at its northern end. We descend from Southampton Row into the tunnel and enter Holborn tram station. The southern end of the subway emerged in less spectacular fashion beneath Waterloo Bridge, which was then undergoing rebuilding. On the underground we see a former district railway train in service on the East London line, followed by a metropolitan unit on inner circle duties at Moorgate. This is the approach to Ealing Broadway Station, with a train of Central London Railway tube stock arriving. In the early 1930s, work started on building new Central London Line platforms at Holborn to replace the original station at British Museum and provide better interchange facilities with the Piccadilly line. Here we see the new station tunnels under construction, with typical trains of the period passing through. The new station opened on the 25th of September 1933 and British Museum closed. Derby Day at Epsom has always attracted large crowds, and at busy times numerous buses were needed to carry passengers to and from the racecourse. At times like this, every available vehicle inherited by London Transport would be pressed into service. ST1034 appears to be having trouble with its radiator. On less busy routes, London Transport would operate single-deckers, such as this example of the attractive CR type, first introduced in 1939. This C-Class Leyland Cub was based at Old Kent Road Garage and used on inter-station services. Finally, we see a T-Class Green Line coach. And a single-deck version of the six-wheeled LT, both very handsome vehicles indeed. Prior to mechanisation, the job of unloading the ships into lighters was very labour intensive, but provided regular work for many people from the local area. From the docks, the cargoes would be dispatched to their ultimate destination by either rail or road. At Billingsgate Market, consignments of fish could vary from a crate of wriggling live eels to much larger specimens which required individual handling. Commuting has long been part of London life, presenting the daily sight of people swarming in and out of the city. Here, an up business train arrives at Liverpool Street Station sometime in the 1920s. Earlier in the decade, bright coloured stripes were painted on the carriages to allow easy identification of first, second and third class compartments. Because of the resulting garish mix, it became known as the jazz service after the music introduced to England from America by the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1919. Here the bus stand outside Victoria Station appears to be doing a lively trade, with vehicles of various types very much in evidence, as indeed they are at the bank. What could be more symbolic of London pride than the dome of St Paul's? This is a view from St Paul's looking towards Ludgate Hill, with various STL buses passing below, plus the odd LT. The streets of London have always been peopled by interesting characters, from men working on building schemes with nothing more mechanised than a simple cement mixer, to GPO contractors installing new telephone lines. There were also traders such as this man repairing a chair, and someone who serenaded passers-by with a tune from the barrel organ, all earning an honest penny. I wonder if these children pushing prams were hoping to find employment as nannies when they grew up, like the two ladies on the right. This flower seller seems to have a discerning customer. Fox furs were very popular amongst ladies during the 1930s. But of course, whatever the trade, everything stops for lunch. Be that for workmen, or little girls playing on council flat steps. Who can these be looking at? Obviously this individual revelled in being noticed. Who said long hair started with the Beatles? OK, officer, it's a fair cop. This is a bill poster at work. Is he promoting non-stop variety? Or could it be the Academy in Leytonstone, where the latest film starring Myrna Loy and William Powell was on offer? An everyday scene of pre-war Leytonstone is recalled here by this wonderful rare colour footage. As trams and buses pass by, a monument stands in mute testimony to the sons of Leyton and Leytonstone who left home to fight a war and never returned. It all seems light years away from the present era, but thankfully someone took the trouble to record these scenes, otherwise they would not have been available for us to enjoy today. Are these people just making their daily journey to or from work, I wonder? Back in the 1930s, London's main airport was served by the Southern Railway and was easily reached by frequent electric trains as seen here at Clapham Junction. The airport was at Croydon, and from here it was possible to fly direct to continental Europe with companies such as Imperial Airways. There had been an earlier aerodrome at nearby Wadham, but even by 1927 this had become too small for its ever-increasing traffic. Therefore, attention turned to Croydon, where a new purpose-built airport was laid out. From here, it was possible to fly in one of these wonderful biplanes and start a journey to far-flung parts of the empire. In 1935, the London Passenger Transport Board announced a government-assisted scheme which included taking over some steamworks suburban lines and incorporating these into the underground system. Amongst these lines was the Ongar branch in Essex. The tracks from London to Epping were electrified in 1949, having been delayed by the onset of the Second World War, but the section to Ongar remained steamworked until 1957. The terminus at Ongar was a typical Great Eastern Country station, with a single platform face and adjoining goods yard. The section of the LNER Northern Heights line through Finchley Central to High Barnet and Mill Hill East was also electrified and is seen here in the 1970s when it was served by red-liveried 1938 tube stock. These trains were introduced in readiness for the proposed tube extensions and were intended to replace earlier stock. On the subsurface district and metropolitan lines, trains such as this F-stock of 1920 were to be eventually phased out and replaced by smart new units such as these, which typified the 1930s. As that decade drew to a close, however, the advent of another war with Germany became inevitable. In the capital, Londoners braced themselves for the coming air raids, and buildings were sandbagged to protect them from flying debris. Anti-aircraft precautions included guns which were installed in public parks, together with barrage balloons. Many children were evacuated to the relative safety of rural areas, whilst those who remained sheltered as best they could. Many spent their nights in fitful sleep on underground stations, not knowing whether their home, place of work, or even family would still exist in the morning. In the midst of all this airborne carnage, public transport was heavily disrupted, with buses destroyed and railway lines damaged. After a long and bloody conflict, Germany surrendered, and the war ended in 1945. This rare colour film shows huge crowds gathering in Piccadilly Circus, revelling in the fact that at long last the hostilities were over. The world-famous statue of Eros would soon be visible again, but for the time being its covering provided a pinnacle for the celebrations. Party hats and Union Jacks were everywhere. London and Londoners had suffered terribly during the war, with nightly bombing raids during 1940 and 41, together with a more recent experience of Hitler's dreaded V-weapons. Of these, the V1s, deadly as they were, received the odd nickname of doodlebugs and were less feared than their evil successors, the V2s. Now Hitler was dead, and the threat of wholesale destruction dropping from the skies was mercifully a thing of the past. No wonder they welcomed the victory flypast. As the capital slowly readjusted to peacetime, London transport soldiered on, and new buses of the RT type began to appear. Although the war was over, people in uniform continued to be a familiar sight. A journey on the post-war underground system still offered a wide variety of rolling stock, some of which still showed evidence of the protective mesh added to the windows in the Blitz. Standard stock could still be seen on tube lines, whilst other earlier trains remained operative on the District and Metropolitan. Although London Transport had started building new RT-class buses in 1939, the hostilities held up production and many old types remained in service during the post-war era. Of these, the most prominent was the handsome STL. This film, taken at Victoria, shows a fine selection of these buses, including some which retain white-painted mudguards to aid visibility in the wartime blackout. Here an STL passes bombed buildings near St Paul's. Once the war was over, the replacement of trams by buses regained momentum, although for a few years at least, these fine old vehicles were to continue gracing our roads, as seen here near Victoria. Here, modern buses of the RT type can be seen having to turn round instead of just reversing as the trams would have done. Despite their usual efficiency, trams sometimes suffered problems such as ploughs being wedged in the conduit. Because of this incapacitated tram, other vehicles are having to work wrong line to get around it. When events like this occurred, staff had to be called out to release the offending plough before traffic could recommence. The trams had served the capital well, and for many Londoners they remained the most popular form of travel. Fortunately, their last years were relatively well recorded on film, and therefore scenes such as this have been preserved for posterity. As can be seen from this preserved example, the RT bus of 1939 was a vast improvement on its forebears, although its general appearance bore some similarity to the earlier STLs. Here we see some more early RTs. Many additional RTs were built in the post-war era, and some of these were destined to remain in regular service until 1979. The RT was truly a classic London bus. STLs were used to operate some of the special services which carried passengers to that showpiece of 1951, the Festival of Britain. The famous logo designed by Abraham Games attracted visitors from far and wide. The festival was held on the south bank of the Thames near Waterloo and was described at the time as a tonic to the nation. Amongst the attractions was a large object known as a skylon, which pointed the way to a brave new post-war world. Much of the show was intended as pure entertainment, and although some scoffed at the expense of staging it, the entertainer Noel Coward sarcastically pleaded for approval with his song "Don't Make Fun of the Festival." Advances in technology were also featured, ranging from a pre-war supermarine seaplane to examples of more up-to-date aero engineering. In the Transport Pavilion could be seen a selection of locomotives built for the Indian government railways. The festival closed to the public on Sunday 30th of September 1951 and was subsequently dismantled. Whilst it was still in progress, it was possible to travel by boat between the main exhibition and the festival gardens near Battersea Power Station. Inside the gardens could be found all the fun of the fair, ranging from various types of roundabout to the inevitable scenic railway, or roller coaster as it would be called today. There was also the quaint and curious, far-tottering and Oyster Creek miniature railway, which was There was also the quaint and curious far-tottering and Oyster Creek miniature railway, which was based on a popular cartoon series by humorist Roland Emmett and employed strange, eccentric motive power. Sadly, the sun was soon to set on all these frivolities, and the south bank of the Thames ceased to echo with the excitement of those visiting either the festival itself or Emmett's funny little railway. Some of the roads around the docks had bridges that could either be lifted or swung to allow ships to pass through. Here we glimpse two wartime austerity buses passing over one of these bridges before preparations are made to open it for river traffic. Similar gates to those used on railway level crossings are close to the road, then the operator in his cabin disengages the bridge with a lever and swings it clear. Road traffic would then wait until the boat had passed through. The shortage of buses in the early post-war years meant that various veterans, including these LT Class 6-wheelers, remained in service perhaps longer than intended. Here an LT is seen passing a bombed-out cinema. Buses from the provinces were also brought into the capital to make up numbers and presented a strange sight passing through war-torn London in their unfamiliar liveries. July 1952 was to see the end of London's trams, and a number of special runs were made to allow interested people to enjoy a final ride. These splendid vehicles, seen here in glorious colour, had given years of faithful service to the capital, and their demise was deeply regretted by many. During their final days they were well recorded on film, trundling through the streets which they had somehow made their own. So much had trams become part of popular culture that Michael Flanders and Donald Swan recorded a lament called The Last of the Line, whilst an entire episode of The Goon Show was devoted to a tram driven by Henry Crun, which escaped the breakers by hiding in the Kingsway subway. With the passing of the trams, there is no doubt that a part of London died with them. From 5th of July 1952, the tracks were either filled in or lifted, and buses reigned supreme. These sad but historic views were taken by an American who visited London in 1952 but was too late to film the cars in service. However, on learning of the scrapyard, he made his way to Pennell Road, where the staff seemed only too pleased to provide him with some movement by operating the traverser. Notice how the tram's headlight still had its mask for working in the blackout. This is tram number 2055 being pushed to her ignominious end by a tractor. As 2055 is reduced to a shapeless skeleton of white-hot metal, a whole era of London's transport is consigned to the ashes. With poignant views such as these at Pennell Road, it seems such a great shame that more of these marvellous old vehicles were not preserved. Many arrived straight from service, still displaying their final route numbers. In a very short while, all of these trams were destined to join the funeral pyre of number 2055 and become heaps of smouldering scrap. Even into the 1950s, much of London was left devastated and in ruins. The area around the city was particularly bad, with numerous bombed buildings reduced to rubble and laid to waste. Here, two RTs passed St Paul's Cathedral, which, although substantially intact, never escaped completely unscathed. The post-war era saw new designs of rolling stock appearing on the Underground and a change from red livery to unpainted aluminium. Here, a prototype train of 1956 stock is seen leaving Acton Town. New trains were required for the Metropolitan line when the route to Amersham was electrified, and these became known as the A60s. Steam was retained at Neasden and Lilliebridge depots for use on engineering trains. These ex-Great Western pannier tanks continued in London Transport Service until 1971. The shuttle service along the single-track branch between Acton Town and South Acton was withdrawn from the 2nd of March 1959. The line had been opened by the Metropolitan District Railway on the 13th of June 1905 and was double-tracked until 1932. This fascinating piece of film, taken from the cab, records a journey along the branch and into the simple but adequate terminus which adjoined the North London line station of the same name. On arrival, the driver would change ends and prepare to return. It was sometimes referred to by staff as the tea run, because the return trip was so short that they could go out and back by the time the kettle boiled. Since 1939, it had been worked by a pair of ex-District Railway G-stock cars, which had been specially converted to run as single units and took turns in providing the service. We now visit the Central Line to see standard stock in operation during the 1950s over lines which had been acquired from the LNER under the pre-war New Works Plan. This is Newbury Park, with the tube lines either side and the redundant LNER formation to Ilford and Seven Kings in the centre. The world-famous Routemaster bus made its debut in 1954 with this handsome prototype known as RM1. It was a completely new design and makes an interesting comparison with the Leyland variant of the RT class seen here. With their sleek, modernistic lines, the Routemasters became extremely popular, and they were worthy successors to the vehicles which they had replaced. Sadly, the Routemaster was destined to take over many of the services previously worked by trolleybuses. These impressive vehicles, which collected their electric power from overhead wiring, were phased out during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Because they were restricted to routes that were wired, they were less adaptable than motor buses, but in the light of current pollution problems, their wholesale scrapping now seems rather short-sighted. Colindale Depot in North London became a graveyard for these fine vehicles. After withdrawal, they were brought into the yard and reduced to scrap, therefore recalling scenes at Pennell Road a decade earlier. As the breakers tore into the carcasses, removing anything that might have a scrap value, they brought to a close an auspicious era which started around 3 decades earlier with the pioneer diddlers of 1930.